ladies and gentlemen, it's a miserable November evening, isn't it? But we have a topic which should provide some heated debate. Which species should we choose to save from extinction, and on what basis do we decide? On what basis do we make that decision? Perhaps we could just get a sense from you, actually. How important do you think it is to save species from extinction? So perhaps I could just do a little survey to see how we feel about this. So if you sort of feel, yeah, not very important, just say, nah, not very important. Good. What about, yeah, quite important, but to be honest, there's lots of other more important things to do in conservation. Right, things are looking good, folks. What about, yes, it's important? Yeah, oh, great.
Okay, let's go for the wine reception then.
Yeah. We're all off then, aren't we? Okay. But let's just think about another thing. How many of you have thought about whether you're a pragmatic conservationist or not? So the situation we're in nowadays is, to be honest, times are hard for conservation. There's not that much money away. When I was in my heyday of being a conservationist working in Indonesia, there was massive flows of money coming from the multilateral agencies, from USAID and so forth. We were flush with money. Up until the economic crisis, the big foundations in the world were giving out money for conservation. But as we know, interest rates are rubbish. So there's not that much money for the foundations to give out. When I started my career in conservation in the 1980s, local government was doing conservation. How many local governments have got budgets for conservation nowadays? Not many, okay? But at the same time, the cost of conservation is going up all the time. We seem to have to consult with everybody now before we do anything. The transaction costs of doing conservation are going up. Indeed, even the cost of becoming a conservationist is going up. Nowadays, you need to do an MSc, you know? It's a 20, 25k investment before you even get into the workplace. And I'm sure you'd agree that maybe our young conservationists need to be paid well. So we're in a tight spot, and that's what we're going to think about tonight. So, pragmatic conservationists? Haven't thought about it? Let's see how we go. We've got a fantastic panel to help you to think about this issue. I'm going to start off over there with Nisha Owen, who's from the ZSL EDGE program, Edge of Extinction program. Now, Nisha, she's, in my mind, she's had a bit of a glamorous conservation career. She's studied elephants and tigers in India, exotic flora in Tanzania, jaguars and peccaries in the Amazon, and swift fox on the prairie. She makes me feel a bit of a conservation suit. So please welcome Dr. Nisha Owen, ladies and gentlemen. And then we have Colin Clubbe. Colin's head of conservation science at Kew Gardens, knows everything there is to know about the conservation of plants and fungi. Probably not quite everything, but he's an absolute expert on island conservation and the planning and prioritisation of conservation on islands. He's been in the business, he's been with Kew for 20 years, and perhaps importantly for this debate this evening, he's been on the International Red List Committee for several years. As you know, the Red List is how we categorise species according to their extinction risk. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Colin Clubbe. And last but not least, we have John Frizell. John Frizell is, for me, a heroic environmental campaigner. Been with Greenpeace, just retired, I think, from Greenpeace, for 40 years. And John was one of the people really bringing that issue of whales to the public attention. And I think we should applaud the success of his era, his team in that. I mean, we now take it for granted that whales, you know, we value them, we conserve them, they're coming back. But John was one of those people who was out there on the whaling, on the seas, in the harbours, as he was telling me, learning the craft of environmental campaigning. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John. So the format for this evening is each of our panellists is going to give us a 5-minute pitch on why we should choose, or should we choose, which species to conserve, and on what basis. I'm then going to see if I can get a bit of debate going amongst them. Hopefully they're not all going to say the same thing. And after we've done that for a little bit, then it's your time. And rather than Q&A, I hope you can come in on this spirit of debate. So rather than just asking a question, say, no, this is how I think about things. I agree with that, I disagree with that. Hopefully that'll get us all nice and warm for when we leave. So Nisha, can I ask you to kick us off with your perspective on this question?
Absolutely. So I've got a few slides, not very many. Oh, there it is, thanks. So basically, biodiversity is in crisis. We're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. So current extinction rates are 1,000 times higher than the fossil record, and 1/5 of all vertebrates are threatened with extinction. The problem is, not only do we not have enough resources, but actually we're choosing to focus on very specific small groups of species. So our conservation efforts are heavily biased. So a 2009 study found that 75% of threatened mammals and 90% of threatened amphibians were receiving little or no conservation attention. Another review of conservation funding and conservation projects over 3 decades found that of mammalian conservation projects, only 3 orders were being focused on. So 70% of these projects were focusing on primates, carnivores, and hoofed mammals. So that is a massive bias in our existing conservation efforts, especially when we consider that mammals are only 5,500 species out of more than 1 million known species. So we also need to consider that when we lose a species, we're also losing millions of years of evolutionary history that they represent. And species extinctions also impact on the health of ecosystems. So when we lose a species, the ecosystem health suffers, we reduce functional diversity, we reduce community complexity, and we lose their resilience to change. What we need to be doing is considering the overall tree of life. That's what we want to preserve. We want to be able to maintain that shape. And if extinction was random, that would be okay, because we would still be able to maintain that. But the problem is that many groups of species that are related are becoming threatened. So we're on track to lose entire lineages, entire branches of the tree of life. So some examples might be elephants, pangolins, and long-beaked echidnas. So what we really need is some way of incorporating evolutionary history, what we call evolutionary distinctiveness, into conservation. And the program that I work on, the Edge of Existence program, that's exactly what we try to do. So we focus on evolutionarily distinct and globally endangered species. And what that means is that we're able to calculate the numbers of millions of years of evolutionary history that is represented by a particular species, and we assign it a value based on that. And then we weight that by urgency of action. So this is global endangerment, and this is basically the IUCN level of threat. So if a species is highly evolutionarily distinct, and it's highly threatened, then it ranks very highly in our conservation prioritization. What we've been able to do is do that for a number of taxonomic groups. So we've done that for mammals, for birds, for amphibians, and even for corals. And we've been able to come up with a top 100, so priority species in each of those groups. So just to kind of illustrate my meaning here, if you see this hypothetical tree, if we were thinking about which species we should be focusing our conservation efforts on the left, we've got a long-beaked echidna. So this is represented by a very long branch. It diverged a very long time ago, and it doesn't have any living relatives. If we compare that to the brown and the black rat on the other side of the tree, you can see that they diverged fairly recently, and they have a lot of close living relatives. So if we let the echidna go extinct, we change the shape of the overall tree of life that results. And we lose all those millions of years of evolutionary history. And that's a much greater biological loss than if we were to lose one of the rat species, simply because their living relatives mean that that genetic diversity carries on. So what we found, actually, is that these top 100 species of mammals, amphibians, birds, and the top 50 corals are unique. They're completely unique in the way that they look, they live and behave, and in the genetic diversity that they hold. They have very few or no close living relatives. And if we lose them, there's nothing else like them on the earth to replace them. So the problem is that they're very frequently overlooked by the conservation community. So of those top 350 species, 70% receive little or no conservation attention. So we really need to be doing something about this. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more now about some of these species. They actually do include many of the usual suspects, so black rhinos, elephants, pandas, and obviously the great apes. But they also include a number of other species that you've probably never heard of. We've got the Chinese giant salamander. This is the world's largest amphibian. At 1.8 meters, it's as big as a man. It's critically endangered because millions of them have been taken from the wild and put into farms to supply the food trade in China. We've got the purple frog. This was only discovered in 2003. It is the sole member of its family, and it lives underground all year, except when it emerges during the monsoon to breed in India. We've got the kakapo. Some of you might have seen this. This is the world's largest, this is the world's heaviest parrot. It's the only nocturnal and flightless parrot. Less than 125 individuals remain, and they're on 3 heavily managed islands in New Zealand. We've got the Philippine eagle. This is one of my favourites. This is also known as the monkey-eating or the lion-headed eagle. It's one of the world's largest and most powerful birds of prey, and it's heavily threatened by deforestation because a pair needs an area the size of 25 to 50 square kilometres to raise one single chick, and less than 500 of these birds remain. We've got the long-beaked echidna. So there are 3 long-beaked echidna species found only in New Guinea. One of them has been named after David Attenborough and is known only from a single specimen. They're a monotreme, which means they're one of the few mammals that lay eggs. And actually, you can't really tell from that picture, but they grow up to 1 metre in length. So they're really quite striking animals. And we've also got another one of my favourites. This is the world's smallest sloth. This is the Pygmy Sloth. This animal is found only on a tiny island of 4.3 square kilometres off the coast of mainland Panama, and less than 100 individuals remain in the wild. So, as you can see, there are a lot of species out there that we're not focusing our conservation efforts on, and what I'd urge you to do is to raise awareness of these species and raise awareness of the fact that it is important for us to consider evolutionary distinctiveness when we consider what we should be conserving. Thank you very much.
Very good. So what a start. Consciously or otherwise, we're choosing anyway. So let's focus on the tree of life, making sure we conserve those unique and special branches on that tree of life. Colin, what's your take on this?
On the tree of life?
No, on your pitch, on the question.
Oh.
Yeah, we'll get back to that in a moment.
Okay, well,
yeah.
thanks for the opportunity of talking about plants. And of course, plants provide the baseline, the basis for virtually all ecosystems. So we need to look at plants in their own habitat. And of course, the great unknown within that is fungi. But what do we actually know about plant diversity and plant richness? Any of you who have looked at the plant list, we're trying to make sense of over 1 million plant names, and we've distilled that down, the global plant community, to currently recognizing 350,699 validly published names. So that's our baseline species richness, just over 350,000 species. There's going to be some taxonomic changes in there, and the global plant community are adding about 2,000 species, new to science, plant species to that. So we estimate we're dealing with probably 400,000 species of plants on this planet. So how do we start prioritizing those? Well, conservation intervention wouldn't be needed if it wasn't for us. So one good way to start is perhaps trying to prevent extinctions. Extinctions like the St. Helena olive, which went extinct in 2004, and we've completely lost that. And actually, it's one of the few that we know that's a monotypic genus. So it is actually a unique line of evolution that Nisha was just talking about. But what do we know about the threatened species? And in fact, there's just been a release today. I haven't actually had a chance to read it properly. But the latest release of the Red List was published today, 2015.4. But 2015.3, the earlier one, really only had 20,000 species, just over, of plants assessed for their threat status. And of those, about half of them, just over 10,000, have a threatened status. But that only represents about 6% of known species having been assessed, but 50% of those, or 54% of those, being threatened, although the threatened plants only represent 3% of known plants. So we've got a big data gap. If we're using threat status, which we need to do, we need to accelerate. And so one of the things, and a lot of the team are actually here tonight on the Sample Red List Index project, which is a program we've got at Kew, which is trying to really bottom out where between that 3% and 54% is the current status of the world's plants. And they've published a couple of years ago an estimate of about 20%, just over 20%, 1 in 5 plants threatened. The reassessments, which will be published early next year, will tell us, is that trend increasing or decreasing? So let's park threatened plants. We need to accelerate that. But what about other plants? Plants that we use. We've all been enjoying plants at some point today. Plants that provide us with food. Is that a group that we should be looking at? Again, various estimates around what do we know about the plants we use. Well, actually, the global food chain is reliant on about 150 species out of those 400,000 species estimates. And actually, of our plant calorie intake, 80% probably comes from 12 domesticated species. But we also think there's about 7,000 species regularly cultivated and possibly 30,000 species that are edible. So here's a group perhaps to try and prioritize from a food security perspective. We also know that we derive medicines from plants. 85% of the world are reliant on plants for their primary medical care. Even in Europe, 25% of prescription drugs are derived directly from plants. Very rich traditions. This Chinese traditional medicine tradition uses about 5,000 species. The Indian, about 7,000 species. So we've got this group of medicinal plants that ought to attract our attention. Phylogenetic uniqueness, nicely introduced for us, is again something we would like to do. We're actively working on trying to complete the plant and fungal tree of life, but we've got a long way to go. But what we do know is here's a species that we're working on. This is the island of St. Helena. This is the St. Helena boxwood. You're looking at the global population of that species. It's also monotypic, so it's actually a unique line as well. So we're trying to do that, but we've got a long way to go in terms of data to complete the plant and fungal tree of life. We've got an advantage, and this is where I would actually add in 2 final points in terms of prioritizing actions rather than prioritizing species. We have an advantage with plants. They produce a overwintering or an overdry period survival mechanism. They produce seeds or they produce spores. And we're able to store those. We're able to actually put those in long-term cold storage, in seed banks or in cryopreservation. And we understand storage biology quite well. So much so that we can say that there's no real technical reason that a plant should go extinct. So what I would like to prioritize is getting out there and capturing that genetic diversity. If we aren't able to conserve habitats and plants in the wild, at least if we can get out there, work collectively with partners internationally, and secure plants, their genetic diversity in long-term storage, there's the option for a brighter, more positive future outlook for those plants. And that's something many of you have come across our Millennium Seed Bank project, which is something we're doing collectively around the world with more than 100 partners trying to aim to do exactly this. My final point of action, though, actually, Paul introduced it in a way, and I had no idea he was going to say that. The plant community is far too small. We need more botanists. We need to provide career options for botanists. We need more people working in botany and plant conservation to actually secure plants, to secure what we derive from plants. We need to be able to provide options for students. We need to encourage students at all levels to go into botany to provide those plant-based solutions to our challenges. And I think we can do that. Thank you very much indeed.
Fantastic. Thank you. So a great reminder, there's lots of species out there, and the numbers are growing every day, week, month, or whatever. But
Depends how hard the botanists are working.
maybe two bases for choosing there. One was to do the systematic reviews, which takes a bit of time, but there's very well-established ways of doing it. And then another to actually focus on those plants which are useful to humans in different parts of the world and in different ways. And then Colin's moved on to something we'll discuss a little bit later. What are the strategies for action once we know, or once we've thought about what the basis for choosing is? So, John, what's your perspective on this?
Well, the question, how do we prioritize, is even tougher one than it first appears. We need to step back from the question and look at the overview. Species are disappearing at a rate 1,000 times the normal background. Between 100 and 1,000, depends on what you believe. I tend to suspect it's higher rather than lower. And it's because of human activities. People are starting to refer to the present epoch as the Anthropocene because human activities are having a significant global impact. So it's startling that us humans, having realized we're having this impact on the biosphere, are now discussing which species to keep and which to let go, rather than how to fix the whole problem with the biosphere. And the Canadian academic, I'm from Canada originally, the Canadian academic and environmental activist David Suzuki said it better than I could, so I'll quote him. What he said is, there are some things in the world we can't change. Gravity, the speed of light, the laws of thermodynamics, and our biological nature, which requires clean air, clean water, and biodiversity for our health and well-being. Protecting the biosphere should be our highest priority. Other things, like capitalism, free enterprise, the market, are not forces of nature. We invented them. We can change them. It makes no sense to elevate economics above the biosphere. So I don't think that we're smart enough to decide which species to save and which to let go. How could we decide? Could we use biological logic, as Nisha suggested, concentrate our work on the edge species, which represent more of the tree of life? But will what we gain here offset the loss elsewhere? Is the huge effort needed for some of these highly endangered species, which might go extinct anyway, the best use of our limited resources? We might spend £100 million on trying to save the echidna and fail. Should we use economic logic, save the species that are most valuable to us? That seems particularly fraught. Only species that pay their way get to survive. Economic logic doesn't always work very well in contact with the biosphere. Back in '73, an economist called Colin demonstrated in a wonderful paper called The Economics of Extinction that if a growth rate of a species is lower than the interest rate, then the best financial return in the long term, as well as the short term, is to wipe it out as quickly as possible. Basically, by converting those slow-growing units in the wild into fast-growing money in the bank, you're ahead. This is really bad news for slow-growing species like trees or deep-sea fish or whales. A later paper re-examining Clark's work extended it, showing not only is that true, but that the failure of humans to provide resources for species is what explains the bulk of current and threatened extinctions. And of course, economic logic is kind of skewed in this incomplete evaluation of things, places no value on nature. Yet, people calculating values have reckoned that services like air and water purification, pollination of food crops, have been estimated to a value of about £20 trillion a year, which is around 10 times the UK's GNP. So it would appear that to save endangered species, we need to revise our whole economic system to value the biosphere as a provider of right, rather than a source and sink for industrial materials, and so change the course of this new epoch. Of course, that might take a bit of doing. So let's consider what we could do right now, keeping in mind this whole discussion is taking place against the background of global climate change, which is accelerating and making a bad situation even worse. I don't really think that calculations or logic are going to help us much here. It's more like being in a burning building or a sinking ship. You rescue whatever you can as quickly as you can based on what's possible, not what you would like in an ideal world. So species can recover from overhunting, but they can't recover from habitat loss. Pragmatism suggests we focus on preserving habitats, which in turn leads to preserving many species at once, some highly endangered, some less so. But of course, habitats mean resources, and there's stiff competition for resources in an increasingly crowded world. So, I think we do best by focusing on charismatic species as a lever, but not just to protect themselves, but to force protection of their habitat and protect the habitat of other species that share it with them. And in picking our species, we should pick the species where protecting their habitat takes the largest number of other species along with them for the ride. The giant pandas are a good example. We all know their biology makes them hard to conserve. Captive breeding doesn't work very well. They're really expensive. But their habitat overlaps the habitat of other vulnerable endemic species in China. If you save the panda, you get to save the Tibetan macaque and the golden snub-nosed monkey. Nobody knows what a golden snub-nosed monkey looks like, or perhaps you guys do, but most people don't. But everyone knows the giant panda, and they want to save that, and they can bring the other species along with them. And we should think of the sea as well as the land. Marine protected areas are a very good idea, and if you establish a marine protected area, it actually will increase fishing. It'll increase the fish catches outside the protected area, because once you protect an area, fish get to live their full life cycle. You get bigger adult fish, more eggs, more fry, migration out. So it's actually a win-win situation. So I agree with what Colin said earlier. We're the problem. Wildlife, he didn't say that, but I'm paraphrasing it, right? Wildlife does best when it's protected from human impacts. So let's use charismatic species as tools to raise funds and create political pressure and channel those resources into protecting habitats. And while we do it, we need to speak truth to power about the true value of the biosphere.
Very good. Well, if I'm going to try and paraphrase that, maybe two things that we took out of that. Bearing in mind, or just keeping, that we need to keep in mind, I think John was saying, that pragmatism can be an excuse or a way of sidestepping the really big problems which are out there. But there may be charisma, and focusing on charismatic species may become a mobilizing force to help us to change the bigger system. What do you think about that question, Colin or Nisha? Is pragmatism, your approach, is this just a distraction from the bigger problem? The house is burning? The world's going down?
I think
Is it something easy we do?
Even before we get to that point, I think you need to justify how charismatic species protects everything else,
Yes,
because the
absolutely.
focus is on charismatic species, and people don't see the wider context in which they're occupying. So you actually focus on the panda, and people don't really see the habitat it's on.
Okay, just hold that one. Well, actually, I could come back though, but Nisha, do you agree with that? Because I thought, to be honest, I thought you rather cherry-picked on your evolutionary tree. You just put a load of charismatic species up.
I did choose more attractive, more interesting species, I have to say. But I think it's what you've said is very true, because actually there's quite a lot of literature that says that if we focus on umbrella species or flagship species or certain landscape species, that we're just not conserving the habitat that some of these smaller species need. So if you have a wide-ranging, large-bodied mammal, that doesn't mean that you're preserving the microhabitat that particular species of amphibians or birds or even invertebrates might need. So it's a bit of a catch-all to say that we can just focus on these selected large mammals. Sorry.
Okay, I mean, John.
Okay.
Yeah, come on, is that realistic? I mean,
No,
who's going to pay for conserving all these funny little bits of the evolutionary tree? I mean, is this, or would you be against that because you don't like this sort of more economic, materialistic world?
No, I'm for working with whatever is to hand. And it's true that people look at the giant panda, they don't think about habitat, they don't think about acres of mountain and so forth. But they don't have to. All I have to say is, we want that thing protected, and the energy that they provide, you put into protecting the habitat. You simply explain, well, to protect them, you have to protect this area of habitat. And we need to use charismatic species as tools in order to carry the habitat along, because habitat is everything.
I think there was also the need for an economic analysis done there. It would be really interesting. I think the panda is a good example. It's the charismatic species, if you like. Is what proportion of funding that goes into habitat conservation goes into breeding cute, cuddly, small pandas? What proportion actually goes into conserving and actually trying to monitor and ensure the bamboo forests of China are actually supporting that wide range? 25,000 plants comprise the Chinese flora. A lot of those we're losing. A lot of those, they're being overexploited for Chinese medicine. So how much of we talk about conserving the panda as a surrogate or as a flagship for conserving habitats? I'd like to see that analysis done.
But Nisha, I mean, is this a fair argument? It's true, surely the panda is an asset which generates value for conservation money, which then comes into conserving things. It's not that there's this pot of money which goes into conservation and which we can direct. It's part of a system, isn't it?
Yes, but I think what you said about the fact that there's less and less resources at the moment, we are competing, and everyone in the conservation community is competing. So we do have to pick and choose. So if you want to focus on preserving the panda, quite a large percentage of those funds go to captive breeding of pandas because they're so hard to breed and so determined to drive themselves to extinction. Whereas if you have, if you want to focus on edge species or habitats that preserve these smaller, more inconspicuous, frequently overlooked species, how would we justify that need for that money against something as large and cute and cuddly and adorable as a panda or a panda cub?
Can I say, I'm not suggesting that we should go on the way we've been going on in the past, because that hasn't worked very well. What I'm saying is that we should use these species that everybody cares about to change the way that we're approaching this, to pay a far bigger emphasis on protecting large areas of land as a usual habitat, but also ocean. And
come on, that's a fair argument. I mean, would we have an environmental movement without the whale?
Well, consider it, wildlife in general.
This was a question for these two. I was batting on your side here, John.
I think that's very true, but let's look at the panda then. How much, I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but people had recently, I remember reading it recently, we spent millions and millions on pandas. They are an icon of one of the largest conservation NGOs in the world, and they've been that icon for decades now. So that focus on a panda, what has it brought us? Has it been a successful approach? Is it an approach that we want to continue? Or at this stage, do we say, well, something's not working because we still have less money, we're still losing species at an amazing rate. What are we going to do about it? We need a complete rethink.
Okay, let's keep off the panda because it's a slightly off it. The panda is the national treasure of China. They'll decide whether it's conserved or not. I'm going to take you back, though, to that question about pragmatism. So both of you work for institutions, you've got these nice pragmatic approaches to do, that's what your job is. But what about this bigger question, that actually if we're just focusing on pragmatism, we're letting the house burn, that there needs to be engagement with these bigger issues of the biosphere, of climate change, these more, if you like, classic environmental campaign issues. Do you think that's the case, or do you think...
Well, I don't see that pragmatism is not ignoring everything else. I mean, I think pragmatism, if you look at informing botanical understanding of communities, one of the things we're beginning to look at, if you begin to understand individual species or species interactions, then we're saying, okay, so how should we conserve habitats? How important is that particular plant assemblage? And in a world where climate change is driving many of these to the edges of their existence, if we're looking at, say, restoration or recovery or maintenance of habitats, are we beginning to cut the umbilical cord of classical restoration ecology and actually saying now what we ought to be thinking about is functional ecology? Yes, we need to provide a habitat for some of these iconic species or unique species or useful species, but perhaps now they're in a matrix of a suite of species that may not necessarily be native, but actually provide the functional ecology for these processes, both ecological and evolutionary processes, to happen. With a caveat of saying, again, part of the understanding is what we don't want to do, and that's the debate about invasive species and alien species and non-native species, is we want to make sure, and that's where botanical understanding comes in as well, and the pragmatic approach to understanding plant characterization, is that only a small subset of species that are non-native will become invasive, and so are a big problem. And they are a big problem. Invasive species globally are probably second just to habitat fragmentation and loss. So we've tended to label non-native species in this kind of mantra of having to restore to original communities. And I think that's a debate that we need to have more widely. The whole idea of novel ecosystems and functional ecology is important.
Well, let's pick up on that then, because it has been probably been a year of rewilding this year. So this question, should we actually just be moving the focus where we're actually looking at focusing on conserving functional species, and then the extension of that restoring functional species back into ecosystems which they've been lost from. John, do you have a view on that?
Well, restoring species back into ecosystems they've been lost from is usually a very good idea. So, yeah.
So it could be, okay, so a new agenda.
How to do it? That's trickier.
Yeah, that's a good one, yeah. Nisha, what do you think about, I mean, you've gone for phylogenetic diversity, but we are moving more now to a bit of a trait-based ecology and about the traits, the functional roles of not necessarily species that assembly in it. Do you think we should be moving from phylogenetics to functional roles?
It's been proposed that there is actually a link between phylogenetic diversity and functional ecology. So these unique species do play a unique role in their ecosystems. So they are functionally important or ecosystem engineers. But I just wanted to touch on your point of rewilding, because I think that brings a really good example to the conversation, especially since you talked about some of these broader conservation topics. So I think we very much need to remember that conservation is an interdisciplinary subject. So while we might choose our species based on science and evidence base and however we might choose to prioritize them, but actually we're living in a strongly social world. There's a lot of people out there. We're competing with resources, and it's not just about choosing which species we want to conserve. What about our activities on the ground? It's not just habitat restoration. We need to be thinking about communication, education, public awareness, getting people on our side, particularly with the rewilding. I mean, some of the biggest opponents to rewilding in the UK are the people in the countryside. So you've got farmers who oppose it, you've got anglers, you've got people who feel that their way of life, their lifestyles are threatened, and we have to work with those people. And one of the things that we actually do on our Edge of Existence programme is actually we look to build the capacity of in-country early career researchers, and that's another thing that's lacking. So we talked about jobs for conservationists, but that's not just jobs in this country. What about those countries that are rich in biodiversity but strongly lacking in capacity? How do we make sure that they can conserve any of these species that we're talking about?
God, we can see this question just broadens out beautifully, doesn't it, into all sorts of areas of conservation. But let's just keep focused on this question of which species to choose on what basis. I think we've done the basis bit quite nicely now. Colin, you were great in your talk where you started talking about, right, these are some of the things we could do. So just bearing in mind, resources are limited, what sort of things should we be investing in? So, Nisha, do you want to have another go at that? You were just saying, capacity building. Is there, from the edge species approach, are there particular things where, we need to get investment for?
We're not limited. We're not lacking in options for what we want to focus on. So certainly, the habitat conservation is very important. Community awareness is very important, and this capacity building. So we're skilled conservationists. We have access to education. We have access to face-to-face courses and opportunities for learning. But I think conservationists in these developing countries, they need to have those kinds of opportunities, because otherwise we can go there and practice what's been called neocolonialism and telling people what to do, or international NGOs going in there and telling them what to do. But there's no sustainability there. There's no exit strategy. There's no consideration of how they should be leading their own conservation activities and perhaps leading their own prioritisation. So there's national red list assessments and national biodiversity action plans. So we need to be making sure that they know about the best ways to prioritise species or prioritise activities.
Okay. So is this an argument for a bit more of a situated conservation where we create the capacity and then people can do it in their way? So in some ways, the choice debate isn't for us here to make. It's for people to be making, in their own place, in their own way. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah?
I think
Okay.
So.
So Colin, you said, well, maybe one of the things we should be doing is investing in technology, in a sense, these big technologies of seed banks. Is that the case? Mm-hmm. Sounds to me that they're pretty expensive, and picking up on Nisha's point that you can only do them in a few countries. Can you give us a sense of what does it take? What sort of investment are we looking at?
Actually, not a huge investment, really. I mean,
right.
it's a building with deep freezes.
Mm-hmm.
You can you can actually conserve a species. You can conserve the whole genetic diversity of a species. If you're able to collect, and there are algorithms for the number of actual seeds you need, 5 to 10,000, across the number of populations to capture more than 95% of the genetic diversity. And those are actually quite small areas. And in turn, we've done some calculations, and you can basically conserve the whole genetic diversity of a species for about £1,000.
Not bad.
And of course,
are you
what you
suggesting...
can do, you can house them. If you look at a room this size, I mean, you can, I mean, obviously they vary in size, but you know, we could comfortably house in this room, you know, 20% of the world's plant species.
Okay.
And what you need is a stable electricity supply, hopefully from renewable resources.
Of course.
But that's,
we wouldn't dream otherwise, would we? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And a system where people are kind of looking at, you know, making sure it's there. A lot of our partners, for
Colin,
example,
just let me stop you on this. See, £1,000, is that to store the species, or is that to go out and collect it?
that's to get it into the seed bank.
Get it into the seed bank.
Yeah.
Okay. But we can only do this for seeds, can we? Plants. Could we do it for... I mean, should we be going out there, you know, getting collections of all the corals maybe, or getting a bit of DNA from all the animals out there and create this massive, you know, the classic genetic library? Is that what you're saying is an investment we need to make?
Of course, once you start crossing phyla boundaries, I mean, animals is then quite a different... I mean, there are for you know, semen banks and egg banks for particular species that are you know, heavily utilized, domesticated species. That is something that's possible. I was in DEFRA today, and DEFRA is actually trying to persuade us to broaden our seed bank, for example, in terms of you know, what we... But... yeah, it's beginning to stray into countries, into an area that I have no real experience of.
But plants, we know how to do it. It's a good investment to do for plants. Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. John, do you have any concerns with that?
And I agree, it is a good investment. Let's say we get our 20% of plants away, you know, safely. We get them out of the fire, off the burning ship, somewhere safe. Then what? We have to build a new ship. We have to build a new house and restock it. And that's the whole point. Humans are we're the most successful animal around. We use some astonishing proportion of nature's resources, right? 75, I don't know the exact number, I'm sure some of you do, but we use the majority of the sunlight that falls on Earth gets fixed into something that we use, right? And as long as we continue to be so successful, extinctions are going to continue to happen. They're not accidents, they are a natural product of business as usual. And until we change business as usual, it's good to have the seeds safe, but we got to have somewhere to put them.
Nisha, you know, come on, phylogenetic approach. Surely that's something we could use a gene bank approach to. Are you thinking of that in the EDGE project? Well, you know, if they're on the edge, and there's a high risk we might lose them. Are you doing a backup plan of getting DNA or whatever from these species and putting them in some sort of bank, or is that not to do?
We focus on conservation and action, so that wouldn't specifically be our remit. I don't think a genetic bank is a bad idea. I think it could be a very good backup, but it makes me quite sad to think that we might have to put everything essentially into stasis while we finish burning the house down, and then decide where we have to go next and bring it out if there's an out left to, you know, bring them back out to.
Isn't that what we've always done at humans? You know, when there was a war in London, we put all of our treasures out of London, brought it back when... Isn't that... Are you just against it morally or pragmatically?
This is on a global scale. I think that we should... I don't think if we have limited resources, perhaps we should be focusing on putting the fire out rather than thinking, let's dedicate that to preserving what we have. Because with plants is one thing, but with animals, even if you're preserving their genetic material, you lose their behaviours, you lose their social system, all that complexity, all that, you know, the entire ecosystem. So it's not a solution.
But John, you've been at it trying to put the fire out for 40 years, haven't you? Can we still hope that we can do that in the time to save species?
Well, we have to, or we're going to live in a very different future. Our descendants are going to live in a world which has much less natural diversity in it, and that's not just, you know, annoying from an aesthetic point of view. There's an analogy that environmentalists use for a long time, which is you come into an airport, you're getting on the plane, you notice there's a guy on the wing popping rivets out of the wing, and you say to him, "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh, don't worry, they put in way more rivets than you need. I take a few out every time. Wings have never fallen off yet," right? You're going to ride in that plane? But that's Spaceship Earth, and we're riding it right now. Things do go down to a certain point, and then they hit a tipping point. And once, with ecosystems, often when they shift, they shift either irreversibly or in a way that's very difficult to reverse. We're seeing that with some fish populations in areas that once supported bounteous quantities of fish. Now you're getting nothing but jellyfish. So, yeah.
But what do we think about this then? So, you know, I think we all agree that money for conservation is tight, and whatever we want to do to conserve species, we've got to attract money in there. The doom and gloom, the house is burning, it hasn't, I think it's not going to attract more money, is it? So do we need these pragmatic approaches, whether they're good or bad? Let's do this. It's something we can get on with now, and it costs £1,000 a species. Is that what we need? That sort of attitude?
And let's get people involved. That's the other thing we need to do. We need to engage with people more. It's not kind of talking in a scientific community or a group of people like this who are all committed. I mean, you had it right at the beginning in terms of, you know, you had lots of individual up to then a big yes, nothing in between. We need to get out there and engage with people to actually say, you know, biodiversity matters. Biodiversity matters to you. I think some of the application of technology in citizen science is beginning to really open up this funny world of scientists in white lab coats and you know, thinning on top. I haven't got my lab coat on, but you know, we just need to engage with people and say, this is something you can do. This is something you can be, and you can feed back.
Colin,
to
with respect, we've been pretty good at this for years. And when you say engage with people, surely we've got to engage with people who can put some money into it all. I mean, what sort of people are we engaging with? Are we engaging with, you know, our typical citizens? Are we getting down to the City of London and saying, hey guys, you've got some serious money?
We are.
So what sort of people?
I wear a jacket much more often than I used to.
Nisha, what about you? What sort of people are we needing to engage with, and what sort of options
we need to engage with everyone, because everyone has a stake in the future of our planet. Because we need to be engaging with decision makers, we need to be engaging with future conservationists, with communities who are impacted by their natural resource use, the general public, particularly the general public in cities or in developed countries who have a less and less of an idea of what actual nature is like and species that are out there, and anything beyond their local park or their local beach. And we need to get them reinvigorated, inspire that passion, get them involved, make them realise that there's something out there that's worth saving. And I think that's really important. And we can't just do that in a room as scientists talking amongst ourselves. We need to get out there and speak to them.
What are we talking about in terms of species here? Do we need to roll out to understanding the populations? I mean, Colin, you talked about just how much, well, the knowledge shortfalls already. Does that just, it's just beyond us at the moment to start thinking of these questions at the population level?
Not beyond us. I mean, we've got good examples of individual case studies, individual species, and we can extrapolate from those. I think so it's actually to keep that scientific understanding going, and then use those data to influence. I think this is, and you know, we have to decide. You know, as a scientist, you know, we might be a pure scientist, but we need to be an advocate as well for our science, our area, and make sure that we're applying and actually getting in and talking to people as well. So it's inclusive.
Mm-hmm. John, the eco-literacy argument, I mean, you know, I love it, but then I sort of think, well, there's 9 billion people in this world, and there's a lot of them. Is that really a feasible strategy, or do we just end up focusing on the people who'll be up for it anyhow? What do you think about that? Is this more, you know, taking the education approach?
Oh, I think it's right. I mean, this gentleman said it quite right. I mean, the more people realize where things come from, how everything is interconnected, the more people will value nature. It's not an abstract thing. It's an interconnected web, and as you start to pull strands out of it, at a certain point it will all fall apart. And in places that's already happened.
Okay, great. Let's take another.
While I've got the floor, I'd just like to respond to the gentleman who made the comment about the animals, and judging humans. There is a play written a few hundred years ago, and I'm sorry I don't know when and where, but it was on this very subject. There was a congress of animals that met to try the humans. And they had to for humans to survive, they had to get 2 animals on side. So the first one came out was the dog. Oh, I love him, right? And then every other animal, no, no, no. Finally, it's just as humans were going to be eliminated, one animal came forward and spoke for them. It was the mosquito.
Is that should one basis for be choosing of animals which have a place in human culture and human cultural stories, whether mythical or hopefully living as well, because they can be assets in this sort of flagship role for conservation. So let's just take, if you mind, those two on. First of all, Nisha, you've got to answer that question on the phylogenetic tree. I mean, branches fall off, and are you just saving the dead ends?
I think that there are going to be, we do freely admit that there are some species that it's a real struggle to keep alive because their habitats have changed, climate has changed, and they're no longer able to adapt. But I think that they are actually few and far between. If you consider how many millions of years of evolutionary history some of these evolutionarily distinct species hold, it's amazing that they've stayed so robust and so stable for such a long period of time. The Chinese giant salamander has been around since the age of the dinosaurs. And they're so robust, we could consider that they actually hold a lot of evolutionary potential. They've been able to withstand such an extensive changes in the ecosystem that actually we shouldn't be dismissing them all as evolutionary dead ends. We have to consider that there's a lot of potential there, as well as a few species that perhaps we're not going to be able to save. But I'd also like to talk about the conflict issue and communities, if that's okay.
Yes, go for it, yeah. Can I just to pick up there, because I think what you're just touching on there is actually quite an interesting idea that, obviously in science more generally, in policy, the notion of resilience is coming to the fore. And I think you were touching on that, and I hadn't thought about that these very old species may actually be very resilient species. And just as we can learn a lot from the new forest as a very resilient socio-ecological system, they may be really important for learning and thinking about things. So, but go on, Colin.
So I'm just on that point, Paul, and actually some of the ones that are hanging on might be the most resilient end of the population as well.
Yeah,
so I think in a way, if those that have are down to the smallest group, we may have lost, if you think of a trait which is a bell-shaped curve, we might have actually lost the population in the middle, and the ones that have managed to avoid the goats on the cliffs hanging into the sea, the fact that they're there and occupying successfully, they may have traits that are useful for drought resistance, saline resistance because of where they are. So just thinking that we've got, they're down to such a small population, they may still hold the really key genetic diversity to resilience, rather than necessarily, what they've lost is the comfy stuff. Yeah.
John, do you want to just come in on that? And then I'm going to go back to Nisha to talk about the community one, and then we're going to go talking about treating animals badly, okay?
Well, I take your point about resilience. I think it's quite interesting. I hadn't thought of it. I'm visualizing a bell curve with the center chopped out of it and the two sides. I think it's very interesting. Someone earlier mentioned dinosaurs, and this is something that should give us pause for thought. We all tend to look back at age of the dinosaurs. Yeah, they didn't work out. Well, the dinosaurs ruled the Earth for 60 million years. Humans have been around a couple of million, depending on who you believe. So we've got a long time to go before we match the dinosaurs' record. And I'm not going to bet on us at this point.
Nisha, just a quick response.
Yeah, so conflict is a subject that I'm particularly interested in anyway, and we, in the work that we do supporting in-country conservationists, we do work with them to resolve the conflicts that arise, and they're really interesting because they're always between people over wildlife. So you have conflicts between communities, between governments, between conservation organisations. Everyone's perceived to have a different agenda, and so that's probably one of the biggest issues in conservation today, how to deal with these conflicts successfully. And I don't think there's not a right answer, but we do have to accept that we're going to have to compromise, because you have to find a solution that is mutually agreeable to everyone and is arrived at by consensus, because you can't impose a majority decision, because that's just going to undermine any conservation efforts that you have. So it's really important to make sure that everyone's views are heard. And that might mean that we perhaps are less successful with some species populations in some areas than in other areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's explore this intriguing question then. So one way we could think about this is that urban populations are growing, as what goes along with that tends to be a rise in the power of animal welfare views. As we start seeing animals in zoos being looked at very nicely, the population starts thinking that we can we can save species within the human domain, and the argument for conserving species out there in the wild reduces. Agree or disagree with that?
No, completely disagree that it's a good idea. I don't disagree that it's happening, but I think it's a very bad idea.
Yeah, but then the point is that we shouldn't treat our animals so well in zoos.
Anyone want to stick their hand up and agree with that?
I think
Nisha, go for it.
I mean, for ethical purposes, I don't think you could ever accept that that would be an okay thing to do to encourage their conservation. I think we just have to accept that we'll have to find another way to tell the population and tell people about the plight of these animals in the wild.
Yep, Colin?
I absolutely agree.
Yep. Okay, so it might be a trend which is happening, but we need to be factoring that into our thinking. Is that what they... Okay, I think we've got time for another round. Colin, can I just ask you to respond on this idea of, should we still be focusing on in the invasive, non-native divide, or do we need to move beyond that? And it doesn't matter whether you're invasive, non-native; it's whether you can play a functional role or whatever. Then I get the sense that there's a lot of interest in communication. So perhaps we could just go back to that. Any thoughts or experience you've had on what sort of communication works well. And then I want to finish off on the evening on de-extinction. Okay? So, Colin, can you just give us a response to the invasive, native, non-native?
Yes, I think we do need to think about language, but also understand what roles plants, animals are playing. I go back to my earlier point about functional habitats. I think that's something we need to ensure that's happening. And I think a demonization of alien plants or alien species is perhaps past its sell-by date.
Okay. And any thoughts on communication or getting people on board, really, for all of this? John, in some ways, you've been in this business for years, haven't you, in different ways, or different people.
Yeah,
any people which are particularly difficult to get on board, and you've got some good tips or stories to tell us there?
Well, yeah, you need to make the message as clear and simple as possible. And all of us tend to, the more you know, the more you overthink it, the more you give all the detailed steps along the way and write a wiring diagram. But what you need to do is give a very simple, clear statement, which, if you examine it closely, you may find is not factually quite right. It's not a lie, but it's too broad. But it's the too broad statements that people pick up on, right? And they can see it. I'll give you an example. As you know, I used to work with Greenpeace and until quite recently. And we have a campaign, Save the Arctic, Save the Polar Bear. And everybody sees the polar bear, beautiful animal. They all love it. They all want to save the bear. They want to save the Arctic. It's ridiculous. You can't save the Arctic. It's part of the world's weather systems. You have to change climate. You have to halt and reverse climate change. When you say save the polar bear, it's a proxy for save the Arctic, and that's a proxy for stop destroying the climate. And so you make these clear statements, let's save the bear, but the only way you can do it is by changing the whole world economic model, as I suggested earlier, in this case, to deal with climate change. And it's that kind of clear message that takes people down a path. At first, they may not quite understand all the details of the path. If you try to explain it to them all at the beginning, they'll throw their hands up.
Great, thanks. Colin, thoughts on that?
Certainly changing economic models is something we really need to work hard at. Because I think what we need to do, come back, perhaps the contraception point at the back there, is understanding some of the reasons why people have big families. It's actually to secure their future. So it comes back to your point about communication in terms of how do we persuade people to conserve for the future. I remember I used to live in Trinidad and sitting on degraded slopes talking to farmers who were subsistence farmers, trying to persuade them to think about agroforestry systems for soil conservation so that Port of Spain wasn't getting flooded every time there was a rainstorm, which is pretty regularly. His response was, how do I feed my children tomorrow if I have to wait for income for 7 years before the avocados and the mangoes start producing? So it's actually understanding, and that's why coming back to the earlier point there about engagement is important. It's not, and language is important. We're not trying to train people. We're not trying to, increase capacity. What we're trying to do is share experiences which work in the local context and engage people and use the right tools and keys. And we need to be working much more with social scientists and trained educators, teachers, because here I am already being a scientist, actually putting lots of detail in rather than a nice, concise answer. And that's what scientists, we don't know when to stop because, shall I? No, we don't know where to stop. How much detail you've given, because that last bit of detail is the really important bit. But actually, probably I could have made that point with just that first sentence. I rest my case.
Nisha, communication.
Yeah, I completely agree. On the whole, I think scientists are pretty poor communicators. We focus very much on peer-reviewed publications, and I think we should really be focusing on how to reach out to different audiences. One of the things that we've actually been doing is to do just that, is developing an online learning course on introducing conservation. So this is for people who have no interest, no knowledge even, about conservation at all, but they think that they might like to find out more. And so we've been developing this course, and it's been launched for a couple of months now. We've already had over 3,000 people sign up to do it. So it's, we could be using technology, we could be using the internet a lot more effectively. There's no other courses on introducing conservation out there. There's nothing else for people to find that information out about. They have to get it from the media, who are obviously often very biased. So I think it's a really good opportunity that we should be exploiting, and that we should be learning to exploit better. So better training, better courses, better ways that we can practice how we communicate would be perfect.
Right. Running short of time now, so can I just get you to finish on de-extinction? Because I do think that de-extinction is going to be the point of debate for next year. You can just see it coming up so fast. Any thoughts on de-extinction? Part of the solution or not? Or do we leave that for next year?
I'd prefer to go and rediscover them in the wild.
Okay. Focus the money we have on rediscovering them in the wild?
Rather than trying to bring them back from...
Nisha, any thoughts on all this synthetic biology we're getting and the de-extinct things?
I think the cost of those kinds of undertakings is so high that we would be better off spending that on habitat conservation.
Yeah, okay.
Yes,
good.
Or indeed contraception. Because there's too many of us and we're too good at what we do. Yep. Simple as that.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what a discussion, what a debate we've had this evening. It's such a great topic to think about, how do we choose which species to conserve? I'm sure you'll all have taken some things away from you. Things which stuck in my mind was that actually point which, I don't think it's come up again, this think about resilience and these long ages of some of the species. We've really kept, although we've been focusing on species, we've really kept in mind that we've got to see the big picture. And although we might be species conservationists, or if we are species conservationists, we've got to keep active in that arena. I think something else which has come out of this is that there's multiple ways or basis for choosing what species to conserve. But I think something which has come out is that it's not just for, well, it's not for us maybe always, in places like this to decide. Those decisions have to be made locally, and we've got to empower local conservationists and local communities through education or whatever to be having the sort of debates we're having here and putting them into practice. We've also said, well, however pragmatic we are about doing species conservation, ethics matter. We've got to treat the animals well, even, if it may not be in them. And then maybe, what we've just been finishing up on is that if we want to save the species, we've got to talk straight, we've got to keep talking, and we've got to get out there and do the talking. So we're going to go and do that in a moment. We'll keep the discussion going outside. But before we do that, I'd like you to thank our great panellists for leading such a great debate there. And of course, we must thank the organising committee of the London Evolutionary Network, because we wouldn't be here without them. So maybe you could all stand up and where are you all? Fantastic. And And last but not least, let's thank the Linnean Society and all of you here for letting us have this debate in such a wonderful setting.